Every drop of Scotch whisky begins here, in the barley fields of Scotland. The barley is ripe and ready for the Scotch whisky harvest. The combine harvests barley for the Scotch whisky maltings. The barley moves from combine to cart in the field. The loaded cart carries the Scotch whisky barley to the farmyard. Tom checks the barley quality before storage. The barley moisture is perfect for Scotch whisky malting. The barley is stored in the farm silo before transport. The auger transfers Scotch whisky barley into storage. Samples from different silo depths ensure Scotch whisky barley consistency. Farm testing confirms the barley is ready for the distillery. The barley is packed into bulk bags for Scotch whisky delivery. Each Scotch whisky barley bag is sealed and labeled. The barley bags are moved for loading onto the Scotch whisky truck. The Scotch whisky grain truck arrives for loading. The barley bags are loaded for the journey to the maltings. The Scotch whisky barley load is secured for transport. The barley leaves the farm for the Scotch Whisky Distillery. The barley truck travels through the Scottish landscape. The destination is near for the Scotch whisky barley. The Scotch Whisky Distillery is just ahead. Security verifies the barley before it enters the Scotch whisky site. The gate opens to the Scotch Whisky Distillery campus. The Scotch whisky barley arrives at the maltings intake. The truck docks at the Scotch whisky barley intake. The barley bags are ready for unloading at the Scotch whisky maltings. The hoist moves barley bags to the intake hopper. The barley enters the Scotch whisky intake system. The intake grate removes large debris from Scotch whisky barley.
The elevator lifts barley to the Scotch whisky cleaning line.
Cleaning removes chaff and dust from the Scotch whisky barley. The destoner removes stones to protect Scotch whisky malt quality.
Clean barley is stored in the Scotch whisky silos.
The Scotch whisky barley silos hold grain before malting. The control panel manages the Scotch whisky barley intake flow. The barley intake is complete, and the Scotch whisky process moves on. The Scotch Whisky Distillery stands ready for malting. The maltings is the heart of Scotch whisky production.
Hygiene begins at the entrance to the Scotch whisky maltings.
Strict PPE protects the Scotch whisky process.
Hand hygiene protects Scotch whisky from contamination.
Air showers remove particles before Scotch whisky malting. Inside, the Scotch whisky barley begins to germinate. The traditional floor malting is the start of Scotch whisky flavor. The barley is steeped in pure Scottish water for Scotch whisky. Pure water is essential for Scotch whisky malting.
Steeping wakes the barley for Scotch whisky germination.
Aeration keeps the barley healthy during Scotch whisky steeping.
The steep water drains, leaving barley ready for Scotch whisky germination. The wet barley moves to the Scotch whisky germination floor.
The barley is spread to germinate for Scotch whisky malt.
Raking controls the germination of Scotch whisky barley.
Temperature is checked to manage Scotch whisky germination. Turning keeps the Scotch whisky barley cool and even.
The Scotch whisky barley is cleaned before steeping.
The destoner removes stones from Scotch whisky barley.
Magnets remove metal from the Scotch whisky barley stream. Grading ensures uniform barley size for Scotch whisky malting.
Clean barley collects before washing for Scotch whisky.
Washing removes remaining dust from Scotch whisky barley.
Water jets clean the Scotch whisky barley thoroughly.
Dewatering prepares the barley for the Scotch whisky steep. The elevator carries clean barley to the Scotch whisky steep. The steeping vessel fills for the Scotch whisky malting process. Steeping time is controlled for consistent Scotch whisky malt. Air rests help the barley breathe during Scotch whisky steeping. A second water fill continues the Scotch whisky steep. Chitting shows the barley is ready for Scotch whisky germination. The final steep water drains, and Scotch whisky germination begins. The chitted barley is spread for Scotch whisky germination.
Raking forms even beds for Scotch whisky germination. Temperature control is vital for Scotch whisky malt quality. The turner aerates the Scotch whisky barley bed.
Moisture checks track Scotch whisky germination progress. Healthy rootlets indicate successful Scotch whisky germination.
Humidity supports the germination of Scotch whisky barley. The green malt moves to the kiln for Scotch whisky drying. The green malt is loaded into the Scotch whisky kiln.
Peat smoke adds the signature Scotch whisky flavor.
The peat furnace dries and smokes the Scotch whisky malt. Kiln temperature is carefully managed for Scotch whisky malt.
The malt dries into the golden base of Scotch whisky.
Airflow controls the drying of Scotch whisky malt.
Smoke levels are monitored for the perfect Scotch whisky peat.
The dried malt is ready for the next Scotch whisky stage.
The dried malt is discharged from the Scotch whisky kiln. The malt is stored before Scotch whisky milling.
Lab tests confirm the Scotch whisky malt quality.
The malt is approved for the Scotch whisky mill. The malt moves to the mill for Scotch whisky grist. The mill crushes malt into grist for Scotch whisky mashing.
The grist is held before Scotch whisky mashing.
The grist is ready for the Scotch whisky mash tun.
The mash tun is the next step in Scotch whisky production. Hot water and grist mix to begin Scotch whisky mashing.
The mash rake turns the Scotch whisky mash.
Mash temperature is held for Scotch whisky sugar extraction. The sweet wort separates from the Scotch whisky mash.
The golden wort is collected for Scotch whisky fermentation.
The wort clears as it leaves the Scotch whisky mash tun. Spent grain is removed for animal feed after Scotch whisky mashing.
The wort is cooled before Scotch whisky fermentation. Cooled wort enters the washback for Scotch whisky fermentation.
Yeast is added to begin Scotch whisky fermentation.
Fermentation transforms wort into Scotch whisky wash. Temperature is tracked during Scotch whisky fermentation. Control systems manage Scotch whisky fermentation.
Wash samples are tested before Scotch whisky distillation.
Automated valves route liquids in the Scotch Whisky Distillery. The control room monitors Scotch whisky distillation.
The copper pot still is the heart of Scotch whisky distillation. The wash is charged into the Scotch whisky still. Heat vaporizes the alcohol in the Scotch whisky still.
Alcohol vapor travels through the Scotch whisky line arm. The condenser turns vapor back into Scotch whisky liquid.
The spirit safe controls the Scotch whisky cut.
The foreshots are separated from the Scotch whisky heart.
The heart cut becomes the new make Scotch whisky.
The feints are kept for future Scotch whisky distillation.
The new make spirit is the raw Scotch whisky.
New make spirit is sampled before Scotch whisky cask filling.
The new make enters oak casks to become Scotch whisky.
The cask is sealed for Scotch whisky maturation. The casks rest in the Scotch whisky warehouse for years.
Casks are stacked in the Scotch whisky warehouse.
Cask samples reveal the maturing Scotch whisky.
Color and clarity indicate the Scotch whisky's age.
Nosing captures the aroma of maturing Scotch whisky. Tasting confirms the quality of the Scotch whisky cask.
Cask records track the Scotch whisky maturation.
Humidity is controlled in the Scotch whisky warehouse. Every cask is tracked in the Scotch whisky inventory. Mature casks are moved for Scotch whisky disgorging.
The mature Scotch whisky is emptied from the cask. The whisky is held before Scotch whisky filtration.
Filtration polishes the Scotch whisky before blending.
Blending creates the final Scotch whisky character.
Strength is checked before Scotch whisky bottling.
Final filtration prepares the Scotch whisky for bottling.
The bottling line packages the finished Scotch whisky. Each bottle is filled with Scotch whisky.
Fill levels are checked for every Scotch whisky bottle.
Corks seal the Scotch whisky bottles. Capsules finish the Scotch whisky bottle seal.
Labels identify the Scotch whisky brand and age.
Batch codes trace every Scotch whisky bottle.
Automated inspection checks each Scotch whisky bottle.
Each Scotch whisky bottle is placed in a carton. Cartons are sealed for Scotch whisky distribution.
Workers pack Scotch whisky cartons into cases.
Cases are labeled for Scotch whisky tracking.
Robots palletize Scotch whiskey cases with precision. Pallet wrapping stabilizes Scotch whiskey for storage. Pallet labels track Scotch whiskey batches.
Finished Scotch whisky pallets await transfer.
Okay, pull up just past the line there. I'll guide you back into rack 7. Steady now.
The warehouse holds Scotch whiskey in optimal conditions.
Barcode scanning tracks Scotch whisky inventory. The Scotch whisky shipping dock prepares for loading. A truck docks for Scotch whisky loading. Scotch whisky pallets are loaded into the truck. Cargo is secured to protect Scotch whisky in transit.
Temperature records verify Scotch whisky shipping conditions.
Dispatch paperwork completes the Scotch whisky shipment.
The Scotch whisky truck departs for distribution.
Scotch whisky is on its way to customers.
Final Scotch whisky pallets are ready for dispatch.
The warehouse holds Scotch whisky in perfect condition.
Scotch whisky is loaded into containers for shipping.
And this is how modern factories produce Scotch whisky from start to finish.
From barley to bottle, Scotch whisky production is complete.
Subscribe for more real factory breakdowns.
Peat is cut from Scottish bogs for Scotch whisky kilning. Peat stacks dry before delivery to the Scotch Whisky Distillery. The peat is transported to the Scotch whisky kiln. Peat is delivered to fire the Scotch whisky kiln. The peat fire flavors the Scotch whisky malt.
Peat smoke infuses the Scotch whisky malt.
Peated malt gives Scotch whisky its smoky character.
From peat and barley to bottle, Scotch whisky production is complete.